Great, thanks, John. And thank you to MD Publishing for everything. This is really sponsored by the sponsors too. Really important to kind of mention that all the sponsors, which I'm not a sponsor, by the way. I'm not working for a company that sponsors, but their efforts to do this allow a lot of people to attend something like this that wouldn't otherwise be able to attend, including I've done that for several years as a free attendee. Anyway, I'm glad to have you here. I am going to talk relatively fast, but I want to give you time to talk as well. This is an exchange of ideas, an exchange of comments, what works well, what may not work so well at your organization may work well at another organization, or they may want to learn that lesson before they step into something. It may work for you as an individual, one location, and may not work for another person. But the more we collaborate as a community of healthcare technology management professionals, the better we are together, right? And as individuals. This presentation is geared mostly to those people that are either biomed technicians currently, maybe they want to continue that path and be the best biomed that they can be. And I see there's several of you that are seasoned professionals, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about where you come from. And it's also geared towards those people that want to support others in their journey. But I have a little disclaimer. That journey for all of us is very different. It's very, very different. And you need to keep that in mind when you're mentoring somebody, when you are asking yourself where you want to be. It may be that you want to pursue a specialty. It may be that you want to be in project management or leadership or whatever. But as a mentor, make sure that you're not assuming that everybody wants to become a manager. How many of you, leading into this, how many of you are in a management leadership position in your organization? Great. So I'm preaching to the choir for all of us. We've made those mistakes. Hopefully we've made them, or somebody told us not to make those mistakes of assuming that everybody wants to become a Biomed 3, or everybody wants to learn imaging, or everybody wants to become your successor. But we do need to acknowledge that amongst that diversity of interest, there are people that do, and we need to, I believe, do everything we can, even standing aside to make sure that they're the best boss they'll be. And I will probably share with you a little bit about this personal story, but I have worked for people that I used to manage. And I was honored, first of all, that they would even want me to be their employee. But I'll share a little bit about that with you. Now, how many of you are in a servicing role? And I see that there's some hands that are both manager or some sort of leadership position and a servicer. Great. You're kind of bridging that gap. Many of us are working leaders, working managers, whatever. Now, the big $1 million question is, how many of you are here the first time at the MD Expo? Okay. And how many of you are, let's say, less than 3 years in this field? Good. This hopefully will be something to share with you. Maybe you already know some of these things, and you probably do. Some of these are just common sense life things that we'll be talking about, but others are, let's say, wisdom that I picked up along the way, either because I've made the mistake or somebody has said, hey, do this and you'll be more successful. So we're going to talk about advancing your HTM career. I already mentioned that, HTM in the broad scope, but more specifically about biomed. And biomed, by the way, another little disclaimer to me, is anybody that maintains or services medical equipment. So you'll hear me occasionally say imaging service engineer. My mind says biomed. I may say biomed and refer to somebody who's working on x-ray or ultrasound or whatever. it's a good umbrella term for lack of any other term, but I also don't see that the ventilator guy is any different than the guy who specializes in infusion pumps. Some organizations that I've worked for do, and I've had different titles, but I've always been the one that's kind of like, well, what job needs to be done, right? I do know a little bit about ventilators. I'm the imaging service engineer for this organization. How can I help? So we're going to talk about learning and the assessments that you need to constantly consider doing. We're going to talk about mentors and networks. Some of you I saw doing this. Hi, who are you? Where are you from? That's the start of good networking, but don't lose sight of remembering those conversations and continuing them out, not just at this conference, but later. If you have business cards or something else, LinkedIn profiles, a way to share your contact like so many phones do that and connect. Do that absolutely and connect. We're going to talk about, and by the way, I want to be quiet, but I'm a loud guy. We have one of the newest people that might join the Biomed HTM room. So I want to acknowledge that. That's pretty cool. We're going to talk a little bit about continuous and proactive investment, whether or not that is your self-investment or whether or not that's organizational development that is given to you or somewhere in between. And of course, I already kind of mentioned this, but together, we together unlock new doors. Amy has a very good guide, and I hate to kind of promote this in a way, and I know this is being recorded, but I hate to promote this for one reason. I helped with that guide years ago. I was on the Technology Management Council with Amy, and I helped with a guide that basically talked about the biomed career path. And if I had something to change, I mentioned this to you, if I had something to change, I would change at least these two things. One, the biomed career path that we laid out talked about like kind of the typical, if you will, layout of how a biomed might progress in the field. Biomed 1, 2, 3, and somewhere this other thing kind of came in, and it's pretty typical. But the thought that I have is a little different. The other thing that came up is that imaging engineers were after you kind of cut your teeth as a biomed technician. That you had to be a biomed on infusion pumps before you were a imaging engineer. How many of you in this room have worked with somebody that went right into imaging? Okay, at least a few. It's a good example of, you know, dispel these myths, right? Don't follow strictly some guidebook that some well-meaning bonehead like I did contributed to, right? You fight the fights you want to fight. But that is a good example of, because there were about 4 or 5 people that raised their hands in this room. That's a good example of people that know of somebody, or maybe they are themselves. I didn't ask that question. People who went into a specialty, and I could ask this about other specialties. Remember, biomed is biomed to me. We are going to talk, and I did talk about that, about what kind of entry level looks like and what that advancement may look like into leadership. If I forget this, I'm just going to mention it right out of the gate. If you are a good technician, if you're a good service engineer, or whatever your title is, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good leader, manager, or director. Sometimes organizations promote the person that's not as good at those roles because they're great at being a technician. If you would please consider this when you're taking this back to your organizations, consider what value you bring. You might not be a good technician, but maybe you're going to be a good project manager within your organization. Maybe you're going to be a good department manager or supervisor. The mindsets, there's some similarities, but it doesn't translate all the time. And give people the benefit of the doubt when sometimes you go, man, they were great tech, and now they're our manager. They're okay. Make sure that you help. Mentoring can go several different directions. And I am certainly going to talk about building foundational blocks that will help you hopefully throughout your HTM biomed career, and those people that hopefully you will be helping along the way. If you're a biomed, by the way, make sure you're helping other biomeds. If you are a manager in the biomed department, make sure you're helping other biomeds. We all should be helping each other. We're going to touch upon a little bit consulting, research and development. What else I have up there? Regulatory affairs, different non-traditional roles, or roles that we're now seeing become a little bit more traditional, like cybersecurity of medical devices. These areas, fortunately, are wide open for us to build. And I say this, it's kind of an interesting journey that I've taken, but my first civilian biomed job, my boss, great guy in many, many ways. One day I was contemplating taking some classes, and I was trying to figure out how I'd fit those classes into my work day. And I say into my work day because he was generous enough to say, you take the time and then make it up. Give me 40 hours. You punch out, you punch back in when you come back, you can take classes. I'm still a little bit like this, but I didn't want to take advantage of that for a lot of reasons. Personal reasons, I didn't want to seem to be taking advantage of that, taking a class that I didn't need to take or wasn't beneficial to my field or to the generosity that my employer allowed me to take. But this boss, Steve, comes up to me and says, Dustin, you normally have given me a proposal for what days and times you'd like to go to class, and I haven't seen that yet. And don't forget, you need to tell the shop kind of what your schedule is. And I said to Steve, I said, well, last year, and yeah, I'm a little bit of a nerd. Last year, I was taking Latin in the evenings. It was the language that I wanted to pursue post-high school. I know it's a dead language, but hear me out. He says to me, he says, so what's the problem? And I said, well, they moved the schedule. They no longer offer it in the evenings. So if I want to continue that, I have to figure out how I'm going to do that. Maybe they'll offer it next year in the evening, but the whole year they're not going to offer it. And his response was to me something that I kind of knew already, but I hope you all know this. Maybe everybody else knows this in the room, but I didn't really know it until he emphasized it. He said, everything you learn is related to your job in the biomed field. Everything you learn, except, he says, for maybe underwater basket weaving. Now, I have never found a correlation between underwater basket weaving. So if one of you knows how to basket weave underwater or above and can tell me how that applies somehow, even loosely, to biomed, HTM, please tell me so that my story can change a little bit. But Steve tells me this and I'm like, what? Well, yeah. And he says, well, Latin, for example. And I didn't even, he just kind of prompted me. And I said, well, I know it's the root of a lot of the words that we need to know in the medical device industry. He says, yeah. He says, so is, and I go, Greek, which I happen to know a little bit of then. and other languages. And I said, but that doesn't, I mean, I can learn the terms that I need to know, or I've already learned some of the terms that I need to know for my job as a biomed technician. He says, do you know what my first degree was in? Now, Steve tells me this, and I go, well, or asked me. He said, no. He says, it was in German. Now, I already looked up to this guy for so many reasons. As a manager, as a leader. But it made a real impact in something that I already kind of knew. But along my, and I hope along, cutting in and out a little bit, along your journeys, you'll hopefully be able to apply things that maybe, just maybe, the biomed school didn't teach you, the electronics school didn't teach you. They didn't tell you at your ultrasound training, right? But they're applicable. Communication skills like speaking to audiences, English classes. I took creative writing classes because of my night schedule, my day schedule as a biomed and everything. And I can tell you all those things have been fairly useful. I've even used calculus twice as a biomed technician. Now, you can talk to me about that after, but those things that you learn along your journey may be applicable to helping you be a critical thinker, to being able to be a well-rounded professional, to being able to communicate effectively, for that matter, with those clinical staff members and those trades members in other trades, the IT professionals, if they want to be different than a trade. But with everybody else, the non-clinical, the clinical, and the patients, you may have something to talk about. So we'll talk about expanding your horizons, kind of thinking, well, this might not apply today, but I really like this. I'm going to now kind of ask for audience participation. John has reminded me that I'll repeat your questions. So if I repeat them incorrectly, you know, that doesn't translate well or whatever, please let me know, because this is recorded and other people will hear this. So if I paraphrase too poorly, that's really not what you meant, let me know. So I want to ask you guys, I mentioned underwater basket weaving to me, even though I haven't taken an underwater basket weaving class. What sort of things can help you embrace other career opportunities in HTM, or that are kind of adjacent fields, let's say? Think broadly. What things have kind of helped you in your career? And I'm going to kind of pick on somebody if nobody else answers, because I happen to have a conversation before this with somebody that might have an answer from his perspective. Yes. What's that? Accounting. So how has accounting helped you, or how would it be helpful for others in the biomed and HTM fields? Great. So again, for the audience that will see this later, some of those things that you mentioned are being cost effective, understanding where your dollars are going and how those dollars should be spent versus how they are being spent. And as a technician, why is I know you're not a technician. We know each other, but I know you're not a technician right now. But why would that be good for a biomed tech to maybe consider an accounting class, either through the community college or even an accounting degree? Great. So two points again for the audience that's at home, and those were possible career advancements in areas that would require more specific accounting practices, and specifically in your own circle of influence as a technician today, understanding better options possibly, I'm going to paraphrase, but the options that you have and how to manage the dollars for your customer. And I'm going to say customer sometimes interchangeably with your hospital, because some of us are field service engineers, some of us are in hospital, some of us like myself are kind of both, right? I'm the biomed for some hospital that can't have a full-time biomed, but I'm there once a week. But those are all good points. And I will add on accounting, just in general, I have had the opportunity, I think, maybe it was just somebody passing down the work, but I worked in an organization, I worked in the VA in Salt Lake, and that VA at the time, and I think they still do this, that VA asked all of us technicians to review contracts in our areas that we took care of. So the accounting part of it, look at, what's the dollar value? What's good about this? We also reviewed, before we bought new equipment, we were asked to be part of the, sorry about that. We were asked to be part of the review process for specifically whether or not we thought it was more beneficial for us to get training, to have a third party kind of contract, or to have an OEM contract, or some blend in between. All accounting practices, right? And obviously a little bit of a blend of like common sense. Like if I'm already at A, technically, what do I need to be there if we're going to take this on in-house? Great. So we've got that. Does anybody else want to kind of mention something? Yes. So not to assume that they heard this, but your voice carries pretty well. But it was mentioned that IT skills are very important, or could be very important to professionals in your organization. CompTIA IT fundamentals. Sometimes that's overlooked. Sometimes somebody says A+, Net+, S+, so I'm glad that you mentioned something a little different. Now, why IT? I think I know some answers, but so again, at home, the mention are a couple of things. Being able to know what you're talking about, because, and I'll kind of blend these together, because the line, I'm going to quote you hopefully well, the line between IT and biomed is becoming increasingly thinner. Now, I'll just say this though, when I started, which was a while ago, when I started, it was still, we still had systems. We had a lot of systems that were running off of less complex operating systems, right? Like, well, DOS 3.1, I think. That goes back, and some of you may even go further back. We've always had this element, but recently I brought up to my boss, I said, what about that stadiometer from a cybersecurity standpoint? And he says, well, stadiometers don't have any integration or any possible open points to a hack or whatever. I said, well, that one there has the capability of connecting with Bluetooth technology to the EMR. So we've got to know what's inside. And it's not just the electronics, Some of us started with electronics. Some of us started in a biomed school. Some of us started in a different area. But IT, I firmly believe very important for a lot of reasons. Anybody else? Let's move on here then. And what skills and experiences, mainly kind of like what has been one of those aha moments where you're like, oh, I didn't know my hobby could help me do my job. If your hobby's not, like Justin Barber's in the audience, and I'll say this, Justin's one of those guys that I think one of his hobbies, I'm sure you have others, is actually biomed, right? He takes this stuff very seriously even after his workday. But what hobby outside of biomed, or what has translated well for any of you? You're like, oh, that's my aha moment. That I didn't know my interest in, and I'll throw this out there just so that gets the fuel going. I keep tropical fish. I was asked one day to start working on dialysis. Do you know how translatable some of the stuff that has been my passion since I was probably in 5th grade was to supporting dialysis? Now, yeah, the water quality standards are a little different and everything, but some of the same systems, some of the same thought processes as far as water quality were inherently kind of built in because of some hobby that I had. Anybody have some experience like that? Some share? Yes. Again, I already put the disclaimer in there. I might put it in a couple times. I'm a little bit of a, let's call it a nerd, but you're not a nerd in saying this. But what I just heard was reading and reading service manuals. I used to think when I was a first biomed, if you will, it was a great opportunity to learn about a piece of equipment when you were doing the PMs. But how much better is it sometimes if you get a decent service manual with a good theory of operation or something like this to understand that equipment? Is that kind of before you get the call at 2 in the morning, right? Or before you do the PM, you're like, oh, this is easier than it would have been. So reading's obviously something else that can translate into so many other things than service manuals, but service manuals is very key to us in biomed. Educational resources in HTM. I am going to do another like plug here at the end of this slide presentation. When it's available, take a look. I've provided a list of some resources, especially for this kind of area of educational resources that you might want to consider, that you might want to share. Really, I think we need to go back to what we've done sometimes in our industry and get a big list together so that you can pick and choose. But professional associations, AMI, the ACCE, your local biomed associations, your regional biomed associations. It's later mentioned in the slides, but I'm going to mention this right now. If you're not aware of this, many of the biomed associations out there, or HTMA associations, or whatever the title is, now broadcast. They live cast their presentations because they realized that so-and-so who lives in an area of Kentucky doesn't want to drive an hour and a half to get to their local meeting. But I live in Nebraska. What if I want to attend a CAMI meeting? I can sign up. Sometimes I can just ask for a free registration to that presentation. Sometimes you have to be a member, but the local associations are not local anymore, right? It's much better idea, in my opinion, because of networking and because of just kind of being social, to go to those meetings if you can, even if it's an hour away. I live in an area that one would think that an hour drive isn't much, but some people don't show up to our biomed meetings. So they go, oh, in Omaha. It's like, why would you not take advantage of this because of travel times? We've all got our personal lives, but if you can go, work it out. Courses, webinars, I think I've already touched upon that, but I'll touch a little bit more on this. Wednesday webinars, we're all here at the MD Expo. We probably already know about the Wednesday webinars. There's also what are they called? The demos. They're usually on Tuesdays. They're a 20-minute demo, and I find that most of those that I've attended have been very valuable. I get to learn about the vendor. I get to learn about the product, and it also kind of inspires some ideas like, oh, well, they're doing this. I like that. I wonder if anybody else is doing this, or I wonder if we could do this. Those webinars, by the way, a lot of them are recorded, like this one today will be, as a recording, and you can watch it or listen to it at your convenience. Balancing that personal life and that work has become so increasingly easy. The only thing you're probably missing out on if you don't attend the live version of the Wednesday webinars or the other webinars, the real thing that you're missing is the ability to ask the presenter or panelists or whatever some questions. There's also sometimes a little prize or giveaway or something like this. If you're into that, which I wish I was able to attend the Wednesday webinars in person more often, I wouldn't mind. I'd want a t-shirt for them. But the webinars are on demand. Now, how many of you are field service engineers types again? Of about 6 people in the room that are, 7. I have commutes that are long enough, most of my commutes are long enough in my area that I will start my drive. Well, I won't start the drive. I will start up one of these webinars and I'll head on the road and I'll be listening to it. Now, the disadvantage to that is if there's great like material they're showing and stuff, I'm like, oh, I got to remember to go back to that one. But otherwise, if it's well spoken and it connects with me, I can listen to it. And again, maybe I'm looking up to somebody that deserves to be looked up to, in my opinion. But Justin has some rules of repair. And listening for me to his presentation on YouTube of the North Texas, it was one of the Texas Biomed Association meetings last year. Was like, oh, these are great. I had to go and rewatch it though. I was listening to it while I was driving. But don't forget that you can do maybe 2 things and pay attention safely to the road. I haven't gotten in a car accident yet, knock on wood. And learn something, right? It's a conversation that you might be able to have to extend to your organization and say, have we thought of that about this? Or for yourself, have I thought about this as far as my career? Manufacturers. There's some other sessions. There's a session tomorrow that I really want to attend on right to repair. But manufacturers have resources. Not all of them. That's part of the reason we have this right to repair debate and discussion. But some of them, if you go to their website and just sign up, or even some of them, you don't have to sign up, you can find educational content. And yes, you can find their service manuals, or you can dialogue with them in some other way. So manufacturer resources, and I mentioned this kind of more in the online sense, but some manufacturers will do unique things. They'll bring the training to your organization and train 6 of you, as opposed to 1 of you going and it costing half the price of 6 people being trained at your organization. Think about those resources out there. Don't discount them. But if you're not aware of this, go to those manufacturer resources. And one that comes pretty readily to mind, and one that I believe I listed on the resources, is Fluke Biomedical. Fluke demonstrates how to use their test equipment their test equipment, right? You might go, oh, I don't have their test equipment. I have somebody else's. It still may be translatable to understanding what you're doing. Matter of fact, a good example of this is Pronk, for example, has one on electrical safety testing. Pronk has one on defib testing. I believe it was through the Wednesday webinars. Pronk doesn't make a defib tester, but they talk about the importance of why you do these tests in a manufacturing environment and in the hospital environment. So keep those in mind, you know, and those are manufacturers, obviously. And if I haven't belabored the point enough, or if I haven't really brought it up, constantly think about your education. Learning is a continuous journey. It's already brought up that when some of us started in the field, microprocessors were in very few things. PC-based equipment was sporadic. It was maybe in the SICU or whatever, and it wasn't in our NICUs and every other place in our hospital system. If you're not kind of keeping up on what's out there, you're going to be lost. Now, here's another disclaimer. Tread lightly, but tread boldly on your journey of learning. And the reason why I say that is Steve, that same great first civilian supervisor I had, who said to me about underwater basket weaving, he also gave me this opportunity and I fought back. And I'm glad I did, for me. But I don't recommend it for everybody. He said to me on day one, he said, I want to know what you want to do, what you want to specialize in. I said, Steve, this is my first civilian job. I said, I want to learn everything. I want to be able to look at everything. He says, well, you're going to spread yourself thin. I know that shop at the time, we all joked that we were all jacks of all trade. He said, you're going to spread yourself thin. I like, well, I'm just starting. Let me explore. Let me work with the infusion pump guy that usually does the infusion pumps. Let me work with the ventilator guy. Let me work with the x-ray guy. And that was very helpful for me, instead of both kind of limiting myself, what I would have felt limited myself personally in expanding my horizons, but also limiting my career. Now, I said that if you can become a specialist in some areas, sometimes you have to kind of weed out something else or a lot of something else. Steve came back to me 6 months later in the, kind of typical 6-month performance evaluation. He said, so what do you want to specialize in? And I said, I don't. He says, well, I'm going to keep asking you. I'm going to keep asking you. You gotta tell me. And he was very, very supportive. Remember, I said, I really looked up to this guy. I still do. He's still around. I know I'm old. He's a little older. But he said, I'm still going to keep asking you. I don't think that's a good answer for you. He's trying to guide me. My annual review comes up. He asked me the same question. And I don't know if it was the annual or my second annual or whatever, but finally, when I gave him the same response of like, oh, I like learning everything, he says, you know what, for you, seems to be a pretty good thing. I'll back off. Because you have learned a lot about ventilators, a lot about portable x-rays and mammo, but you pitch in everywhere and you learn these other things. That was for me. But I've had good unofficial mentors that I've worked with that have been much, much better at a certain thing because they have focused and honed in on it. So choose your path and be ready to kind of change it every once in a while if you get thrown out the question of like, hey, I need you to cover dialysis because so-and-so in this case is going to be out for a while. You need to learn dialysis. You're now the dialysis guy. self-assessments. This gets me to kind of an important topic, which could have been kind of peppered, and it was a little bit in here. But what do you want to do? What are you capable of doing? And what do you need to do to be there? There are all sorts of different assessments. There are technical assessments. There are, what I will talk about mostly is, it's called personality assessments. Not necessarily that they're all personality based, but I very firmly believe, and this is thanks to my grandfather, that you should do what you like to do and what you're good at doing. And I don't know why he kept telling me that as a kid, because I was like, maybe I'm not going to be good at something that I really like. I think the intersection is better to try and find that intersection of what you like to do. If you don't like being a manager, step down. It's not a step down really, but find a biomed tech position. If you don't like being the biomed tech at this organization, find another technician, service engineer position that you do like. Carlos, who I met just before this presentation, he said to me something that's important for some of us. He doesn't like working in hospitals. He doesn't want to be that in-house guy. And then there are people in this room that I'm sure if I asked for the hands to be raised would say, I don't want to be that field service guy. And then there are some that don't know. Those ones that don't know or haven't explored the idea, they're the in-house biomeds and they're like, I don't know. Or Carlos, if you haven't, you probably have thought about it occasionally. Do I want to be an in-house person? Do a self-assessment. Do a formal self-assessment. In the slides, again, we won't go over these because they're buried at the bottom. There's a bunch of links. There's some free assessments that you can do as far as your personality, your work style, how you work with a team, but I will bring up a couple of opportunities. Many organizations should already have a 180-degree type assessment. Take advantage of that, right? That is kind of maybe leadership down and your conversation with leadership. If you can find, and I have found a couple of links I put in here for 360-degree evaluations. If you're not familiar with those are probably more beneficial. You get feedback. You got to prompt people, I've found out, and say, hey, I'd really like to know anonymously what you think I know well or I do well or whatever, and give me that feedback from your peers, from your direct reports, from your managers, from your customers. It gives you a 360, a fuller perspective of what you do well, what you might do too well, right? You might not be a good fit. They might go, oh, you know too much, right? Your nursing colleagues might give you enough feedback in these usually multiple choice kind of questions to say something like this. And I've seen this. I'm sure you've all seen this too, where you work with the person that's like, incredibly book smart, but they're talking in a jargon that doesn't translate to the clinical staff. So personality and self-assessment skills, but one that I just kind of recently came across that I think is wonderful is look at the book and the assessment that you can take along with it of Working Genius. There's all sorts of different flavors of this, but Working Genius talks about all of us. The theory is that all of us have two. A few might have three, some might have one, what they call working genius in this. Something that they do so well for two reasons. This goes back to what I said my grandfather used to tell me. Do what you like and do what you can do well. Working Genius kind of summarizes that, but they also give us all the encouragement of like, I don't think I do anything well. I'm not a genius, listen to the book, read the book, whatever, but it will help, I think, for many of you clarify why some days you're like, oh, I just feel so drained. Because you might be good at doing something, but it's not what you like doing. And then other days you feel really energized, but you didn't make a lot of progress, and that's maybe more along the lines of something you really like, you think you like, but you're not good at. It's finding those things that you're good at. And then for you who work in teams, and all of us, even the field engineers, we work in teams, right? National support or regional support for others. When you think about it, we all work as teams. For those of you that work in teams, Working Genius also helps if you have that same conversation and everybody kind of starts saying, what are my working genius types? It's not about like saying, well, so-and-so biomed technician is the wrong hire. It's saying that person can contribute and wants to contribute better in a certain way, and we all can do it better together. And I mentioned better together. But think about it this way. I'll share a little personal story. I worked with a person that had very limited technical skills, but was a biomed tech. In that organization, if we ever had a problem with a vendor, we would sick that person off. If we had a project that we didn't want to spend all the time and detail and put together in the planning, that person was amazing at it, right? So I had coworkers every once in a while saying to me, oh, I don't know. Seems like they send everything out to a vendor. Seems like, the kind of the rhetoric sometimes you unfortunately hear about hey, that person's not as good at something that you value. So biomed techs sometimes go, well, that person doesn't know how to troubleshoot. And I would say, but if we could just give this person more of that as a team, there's 10 of us on this particular team. We can give them that stuff that some of us don't like even doing. Some of us can't do very well. We can take care of the troubleshoot, right? We can do the things that we like, that we think we're better at or whatever. So Working Genius, if there's one takeaway on personality assessments that you haven't heard of, 360 assessment, Myers-Briggs, those kind of things that are kind of generally out there. Use your performance reviews. Worked for one of my other top 3 bosses I've ever worked for. The first year he says, oh, you're doing a great job. All 5s, maybe a 4 or something in there. And I said to him, aren't you going to give me any feedback? And I had a dialogue with him there about how important it was for me to understand, even if he really did think that it was all 5s and 4s or whatever, that I certainly needed something to work on. Now, not to say I am great, because I've also had supervisors say, here's the laundry list of things that you need to work on. Well, maybe not a laundry list, but here's some real critical things at this point in your career you need to work on. But use your performance appraisals to both give good feedback, right? Understandable feedback. Hey, you're doing these things really well. These are some areas that you might want to look into, or I would support, or whatever the language is in your organization. And by the way, end with something else that that person does well. Not the same thing, probably. It's a sandwich method. But use it if you're in a leadership or management position, a mentor position for that matter. But on those formal interviews, you as the person who is being reviewed, or their performance is being reviewed. Great to get all 5s. Usually that means you're going to get a little bit better raise than you would have if you had 4s or 3s. But it isn't going to ultimately be very helpful to you next year and the year after, or as you move to a different organization, as you explore different roles within the organization. And I've already mentioned this on the slide, but map your strengths to the HTM opportunities. If you are just the person that thinks in the mindset of network topologies and cybersecurity and everything, even though there's some integration, probably you don't want to go into dialysis, right? Look for strengthening some of those things that you're really passionate about and getting the right job, or making it in the organization the right job, like I mentioned, with somebody who didn't have the best technical skills. We as a team can do that. We can cover that as long as you cover us on, calling up the vendors and be like, hey, you said parts would be here on this day. I didn't even want to be in the room when that person would call their vendors, or the vendors that sometimes I'd be like, oh, I'm having such a hard time getting this, because I'm maybe a little nicer guy, not always. So I'm going to ask you what key kind of learnings you've applied in your educational pursuits. They'd be training, right? So for example, if you went to one vendor's training, were you able to apply it on another technology similar, maybe even dissimilar? Education like the Wednesday webinars, or, and again, I'm kind of shamelessly plugging, but they're very appropriately plugging that they've given us the opportunity to come here and learn. The Fluke Biomed webinars, Better Biomed, the HTM on the line, those YouTube channels that some of you may not be watching, which I highly recommend. What are some of those? Anybody want to venture? Great. So Carlos, for the audience at home, to summarize it, said one of the things that becomes very important for us in any aspect of what is truly customer service is how we deliver that message, how we communicate, how we interact with our customers. Don't be, and I'll quote him on this, don't be the ghost engineer, the person that goes in, fixes it, and then leaves and doesn't tell anybody. Is that a good way to phrase it there, Carlos? So as far as educational resources, some of those that you might want to consider that are not necessarily traditionally thought of in our area, Toastmasters, right? If you're not familiar with Toastmasters, look them up. I'm going to run out of time here, but Toastmasters. The community colleges, online or in person, oftentimes have a communication class, a customer service class. We mentioned CompTIA earlier, and that one comes to mind too, is CompTIA has a customer service skills certification, and it might be a good gauge, at least, and studying for it might be a good way to think about those things. One thing that I do at conferences, and it may seem that I am outgoing to some of you and others, you know, is I make a point, sometimes as uncomfortable it is for me, who sometimes I am a little introverted, I make a point of meeting somebody new, asking a vendor what they do, right, that I've never met before. And those things, although that's not really an educational resource, maybe help me, right? So I'm going to skip the other question here on the slide. I'm going to go to this real quick, and I'm sorry we're going to run out of time, because this is probably one of the most important things of your biomed or HTM career pathway. And I wish Steve, and even my NCO when I was in the Army Reserves, had told me that this is so important. I looked at chain of command, right? I looked at the senior tech, and I considered that person a mentor. But a mentor should be somebody that you sit down with, virtually, in person, whatever, and you talk about things. You talk about the things that are going on with possibly your family, safe space, with your community, with your other engagements, and with your career. Where you want to go, where you are today, who you work for today, might be a good sounding board, better than maybe your coworker, and you're like, oh, the boss, man, he's horrible today. Because that mentor is probably, not always, going to be outside of your organization or outside of your organizational line of direct reporting. Mentorship is so important, and yet in our industry right now, there are really not very many good mentor-mentee program relationships or opportunities. Amy used to have one. I'm not sure if it's still around, but it kind of comes and goes. And I myself believe that along your journey, you can be maybe getting up there, right? I still got some good years in me, but I need mentors. I need technical mentors, somebody who knows something that will help me be a better technician. I need people who are leadership or accounting mentors, say for example. I need mentors, and I seek them out. Sometimes I find the wrong ones. You got to be polite about it, figure out how you separate that relationship without hurting their feelings too. It's like, maybe our time is, maybe my time is more valuable with X. But mentors are so important, and yet I challenge you that within your organization and within our profession as a whole, do we really have a good handle on what a mentor is? Now, hopefully your organizations, many organizations talk about mentor-mentee relationships, and then they offer this to a limited few, right? It's part of a leader program or something else. Amy, again, may offer it, but when I applied one year, I applied, and I will tell you, I've been in the mentor-mentee program when it was around that I know of. I applied one year as a mentor and a mentee. And they went, well, what are you doing? Right? I wanted a mentor to pair up with a mentor that I didn't know, possibly, somebody that could give me some important things, some gems. And I also wanted to see if I could help somebody else. That should not be foreign. It was funny that they even asked me, they're like, I see you want both. That's amazing. And I'm like, just because I know one thing and may be able to help somebody isn't going to help me. Look out for those people that think they're everything and they feel like they don't need to know anything else. I've mentioned already continuous learning. Now, networking. Go out. Session's almost over here. It's actually 1 minute over. Go out to the Eclipse. Make a new acquaintance, right? Somebody you don't even know, right? Make an acquaintance with somebody that maybe you haven't really talked to ever, but you kind of know because you've exchanged some emails or whatever. Find opportunities, and I mentioned this too, is going to the local Biomed Association meeting is so much better than going to the online one. And I will share with you that I'm so glad that my association finally, my main association finally got online with these. But darn it, the last meeting in March, I was in Kansas. The meeting was in Omaha. And it was one of my former employees that was presenting, and it was awesome. But I'm working down in Kansas, and I'm working in a clinic that's closed down for the night, doing my biomed thing, and I'm listening to him. I'm like, oh, this is so great, but I wish there to network, to say to the folks at Methodist Hospital, Methodist Nebraska, or CHI, or all these hospital systems in the area that I don't work in. Hey, what are you doing? Who are you? What do you know? If you haven't done this or experienced this yet, you will, especially if you get to meet people. You can reach out to somebody and go, hey, I'm stuck. Do you know what the password is? A simple little thing. Do you know what the password is to this? But it's probably more important, like, hey, we're getting a new nurse call system, and our biomed department has been asked to be really involved. Do you by any chance have the Rollin nurse call system? And that person that you met at this conference, who you didn't talk about that maybe here, It's like, oh yeah, or oh, I know a guy. I know a gal that works at here. Networking is so vitally important just for that. But it's also, as we, kind of started off with, where are your foundations in biomed or HTM? Sometimes we find ourselves looking because we didn't know we were going to be looking for a job. Sometimes we find ourselves looking for a new position because we want, for whatever reason, a new position. Those personal networks, and I know a lot of people say, hey, the field is very small, and it is. But make it smaller. Make sure you know who you're reaching out to. Like I don't know Danny, but I met him sort of right before the presentation. And maybe I'd reach out to Danny and say, hey, who do you work for? I know I'm not looking right now in that area, but I know somebody else that is. I've already done a shameless plug for this guy, but some of you already know there's a guy in the room that does this every once in a while on LinkedIn. He says, hey, I got a, how is it phrased? I don't want him to repeat it, but it's something like, hey, I've got this seasoned Air Force biomed. He's looking for a job in Texas. Seems like a lot of his posts lately are in Texas. I don't know what's going on in Texas, but he puts that out there, and I'm pretty sure by the responses, the thumbs up, and sometimes people will tag somebody else's name or whatever, that the world is now a little bit smaller, and that person that's looking for a new position or just exploring new positions has one more or 10 more connections to possible opportunities that might be a better match or might be a new match. Again, I'm not sure what goes on in the industry, but I know that we all have tenuous relationships, reductions in force, terminations, whatever. And sometimes when you're looking for that job, good to know who you're dealing with, right? At least, hey, Danny, right? Hopefully we can catch up after this and I can get to know if you're that guy for me. Danny might say to me, hey, and I've had somebody say this to me before, you should come be my boss. And I did take that opportunity. I actually asked him before that though. I said, why should I be your boss? Why aren't you the boss? He's like, I don't want it. That's a focus area too. If you want to be a biomed technician, be the best biomed technician you can be. Hope to see you all out there. If you guys have any other questions, we can talk about it offline or whatever. And look for this presentation on NB Publishing. Thank you.